So with that in mind, I think what I'm trying to bring up is that when we look at the unconscious, we're going to have to make a decision as to whether we go with the materialist point of view or with a more dualistic point of view, that there is a mind which is not just an epiphenomenon of brain cells, which in the old days they used to call a soul or psyche. And I would say there's a particular problem with that. And the problem is, of course, mythology. The word soul, the concept of soul, the thought of soul, is by definition a religious concept within a religious context. And then how can we study the soul outside of any religious context? How can we study it in a purely psychological context? Is that even possible? And the answer is psychology gave up on that more than 100 years ago. What if there were a way to study these ancient images, both in the etymologies, the way it's talked about, and of course, represented by artifacts and art from all over the world in every tradition? Is there a way to study those concepts outside of a religious framework? Something that would be scientific, but it wouldn't be exactly a materialist way of looking at it, but it might be a heuristic way or phenomenology, which is to say, there's the scientific method that has its value, and then there are other methods like phenomenology and heuristics. What are those? We could spend a long time talking about that, but essentially phenomenology focuses on the phenomenon itself. It brackets the question of, well, it brackets any question it needs to get a hold of the inner experience, the inner subjective experience of a phenomenon. And we could say the phenomenon of soul, outside of any religious context and historical, that would be outside of a Christian context and the Christian idea of soul, outside of a Buddhist context and the Buddhist idea of soul, outside of the Muslim concept and the Muslim view of soul and the Jewish view of soul and the Old Norse view of soul and the soul as it is represented in Mithraism from the 1st century. Any of those contexts, is there a comparative way of just looking at the phenomenon? It brings you right back to Immanuel Kant, because in Kant we are getting a method that separates the thing in itself, Ding an sich, from the world of appearances. So it allows us to look at the world of appearances without, that would be bracketing in the phenomenological sense, the question of the ontological being that lies behind the world of appearances. And the answer is, what would that look like? And it looks like this. All of these images and the history of religion that lies behind it, the mythology, create a field of reference, a system of images that grow like fauna, straight out of the ground of the unconscious. And by knowing enough about the vast array of these images and symbols, we can begin to start to identify different types, different histories, different origins, different functioning. We can look at those symbols in an organic way, saying specifically that we do not know to what the symbols point, but we know they function in this way. In other words, this is the method of Carl Jung, which is to bring together all of the history of world mythology. And also he observed in the dreams of his patient, and he talked about listening and interpreting 60,000 dreams in a period of 6 years, in a time after he broke with Freud, all those dreams. And also, of course, Jung got started in the Berkholzli Psychiatric Clinic in Zurich, where he observed the psychotic fantasies of mentally ill patients. And he began to notice the images and symbols in all three of these arenas: psychotic fantasies, the dreams of everyday people, and the history of world religion shared many of these images in common. So that's why Jung's definition of a symbol is the best possible depiction or formulation of a relatively unknown fact. That's the Kantian piece, right? We don't know ultimately that to which these symbols point, but we know that they point to something. So these images, symbols from dreams, psychotic fantasies, and the history of world religions, that is the data. They are data. We're going to have to talk about this a great deal more, because I think in the next episode we're going to have to get to the structure of the unconscious and the real differences in philosophical approach between Jung and Freud. But clearly there is a layer of the unconscious that is shared by all human beings. And one way to think about it is the evolutionary functioning of human beings, and that is inside of you, inside of me, inside of every little baby that is born, inside every old person at the end of their life. That strata of the unconscious, that is the instinctual functioning of a human being, is there. And these data points about the symbols and the images that can be collected, analyzed, categorized, now opens before us if we can get to this place of defining a symbol as the best expression of a relatively unknown fact. Now, there's the unconscious, right? So, to go back a little bit, psyche is soul, psyche is life force, psyche is butterfly, and the etymologies we looked at start to show this perception of something that is conscious and alive, but not in the body, something that continues. So we have to ask, is it even possible to scientifically examine the image of soul, the concept of soul, the symbol of soul? Is it possible to look at it? And the first issue we run into is that soul is always part of a cultural tradition. How is it possible to take away the cultural overlay? And when I say cultural, I mean mythological. Within a mythological system, which is what we call religion. Now, let me explain how this works a little bit. This is a good example. For instance, you say, well, of course there's a soul, and you can study the soul. Why would anybody doubt that? And the first thing I have to say is, please tell me which mythological tradition you're coming out of. And I'm not doing that to be persnickety. I'm doing that out of an awareness of the history of ideas, the history of symbols. And you say, oh, I just believe in a soul, so how that's self-evident? And I say, I don't believe in a soul or disbelieve in a soul because my purpose is not about belief.
Do you believe?
Well, I can't say. You see, the word belief is a difficult thing for me. I don't believe. I must have a reason for a certain hypothesis. Either I know a thing, and when I know it, I don't need to believe it. If I don't allow myself, for instance, to believe a thing just for the sake of believing it. I can't believe it. But when there are sufficient reasons for a certain hypothesis, I shall accept these reasons, naturally, and should say, we have to reckon with the possibility of so-and-so, you know.
What I can say is that I am very aware and interested that this image of symbol of the soul appears all throughout history and all over the world in a variety of cultural and religious contexts. This is a fact. It's a historical fact, and it's also a psychological fact that people have this idea and are motivated by such an idea of soul. Whether it's, as we said before, whether it's in Africa or the Aborigines in Australia or the South American jungles or Western Christianity, Western Judaism, Islam, China, Japan, the Old Norse, the old Roman religions, back to the Upanishads in India, I'm aware that there is a vast historical tradition of this image. Atman, for instance, is a way of looking at soul, is an image. It's done in a Hindu way, in a Hindu context. And there are other ways and other contexts. So I am trying to understand the history of that symbol to see what we can learn that all of these different aspects have in common, and they point to something. The Kantian part, and then Jung's part about the symbol, is that ultimately, I don't pretend to know what this image of soul points to, ultimately and ontologically. I only know the history of the image and the power, the emotional power, the psychological motivation that the symbol represents when it appears in dreams or fantasies or in a religious cultural context. It's referring to something that is not my ego. What are these images referring to? As a human experience, there's the phenomenology. What are they referring to as a human experience? To me, that's the part that makes this dynamic unconscious, which includes, again, we have to get to another episode in the structure of the unconscious. Certainly it includes what Jung came to call the personal unconscious, or the Freudian unconscious, which is all of the things that happen to us in our lifetime that are unique and individual to each person. But we also have to account for an unconscious that is not unique to each person, but is a part of the inheritance of the human species. This underlying layer that speaks to our behavior, our activities, our sense of meaning, and our creative expression through history and through the world. Now that is a dynamic and very interesting unconscious. As we move forward, that's what I want to talk about.